My name is Jennifer Singleton. I have been working in the animal welfare office for about 6 years now, and I achieved my certified public IACUC administrator's certification in fall 2021. It's actually almost time for my recertification. Let's talk about animal research. The use of animals in research is complex with a wide range of views. We need to consider the viewpoint of the public. Animal research is a sensitive topic, and some people argue that there's no justification for the use of animals in research because we know that vertebrate animals do experience pain and distress, and because those animals are unable to give consent for the procedures that they will experience. Those decisions are being made for them. For some, that is a black and white issue. Other people take a more utilitarian approach. Some research with animals is conducted specifically to benefit a population of animals or the species as a whole. So like wildlife research can benefit both specific populations of animals and the species or a given ecosystem. Veterinary research certainly benefits animals to a great degree, but most animal research is conducted to benefit humans or to advance scientific knowledge. Non-animal alternatives are not always available to answer specific kinds of questions. Questions about whole body physiology or behavior cannot typically be addressed through the use of models or cell cultures. It is essential that every person who uses animals does so in a humane and ethical manner. The public, whether supportive of animal research or not, does apply a considerable level of scrutiny to animal use in research. And that is legitimate because a great deal of the funding that goes into animal research is funding that comes from federal or state sources. So people who are engaged in animal research need to consider these three tenets of ethics, professionalism, and integrity. And for us, we're going to talk mostly focusing on the ethical side of things. Starting with the 3 R's. So this is a set of guiding principles developed in 1959 that really focuses on framing the ethical use of animals in research. And those 3 principles are replacement, reduction, and refinement. First, the replacement. Can we replace the use of animals with a lower species or non-animal model? When we say lower species, we mean a species with lesser levels of cognitive function or neurological sensation. So mice instead of dogs, zebrafish instead of mice, invertebrates instead of vertebrates, though that's not always going to be the case. If we can use computer simulations or mannequins that might be used for medical training, that's a great example of replacement. And then in vitro testing using cell culture is also a really useful technique that can replace the use of animals in a number of situations. And then reduction. Can we reduce the number of animals and still achieve statistically significant data? So a researcher might accomplish reduction by, for example, using one control group for multiple studies with the same treatments, instead of having different control group for different sets of experiments that are being run concurrently. The review of the latest research can reveal opportunities for reduction. And this makes sense from an ethical perspective and from a practical perspective as well, because animals cost money. The maintenance of these animals costs money. And then refinement. Can we refine the procedures to minimize or eliminate pain and distress? Some say that refinement is the most important R when we're talking about this, because review of the latest research can also reveal new and effective practices to enhance animal welfare. And there are many researchers who that is the prime focus of their entire research, is enhancing animal welfare and looking at different options for approaching the same questions and figuring out what would be the best option in terms of minimizing or eliminating pain and distress in animal subjects. So as said, animal research is a privilege afforded to us through society. And by that we mean that we're talking about funding, we're talking about legislation, many different things. So to maintain the public's trust, we need to perform research with animals humanely. That is expected by the public, to use tax dollars for our research responsibly, and to guard against conflict of interest when performing research that's sponsored by private companies. All of these are instances where researchers can and should be practicing ethical truisms. And then what can happen when we lose the public's trust? Because that can happen. There is often an increase in regulatory oversight from those different regulatory bodies. An additional regulatory burden goes along with that additional regulatory oversight. Oftentimes, we're talking about enhanced review schedules, enhanced scrutiny, that sort of thing. Bad publicity, bad reputation, loss of funding, and then I'll sort of going along with that, animal research performing institutions can easily develop bad publicity, bad reputation, and it's sort of a snowball effect sometimes. And when we talk about that permission from the public, what we're talking about are regulations that are being used to allow for animal research within a given framework. For the United States, animal research is regulated by a number of these regulations. So things like the Animal Welfare Act, and we'll talk about all of these in turn. The Animal Welfare Act regulations, which are basically the legislative interpretations of the Animal Welfare Act. The Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. We'll talk about the PHS policy. The Health Research Extension Act of 1985. The U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals. We'll go over all of these things, but then there's the guide and the ag guide there at the end. Those are larger sets of regulations that are relied upon by researchers, by cooks, everyone. So let's talk about the history of public trust and public perceptions of animal research, starting with the story of Pepper the Dalmatian. Now, Pepper the Dalmatian was a family pet that was actually abducted from her home and sold to research and sold for research in the summer of 1965. So she was abducted, she was sold to a research facility across state lines, which is the key issue here, because prior to this whole story, there were still instances of state legislation regarding animals and animal welfare. But once she was sold across state lines, it became much more complicated. The family attempted to rescue Pepper from the facility. They were unsuccessful. The family actually contacted their representative congressman, who then attempted to rescue Pepper, and they were still unsuccessful because there just wasn't anything they can do. And the congressman was the person who actually introduced that legislation to address the use of dogs and cats for research. And that legislation was looking at animal care. It was also looking at sourcing of animals, because I mean, this used to be a common practice. And once the animal was stolen, that was it. This was far before the time of when we were microchipping animals, right? All of this attention also shed light on, so not just that issue of lost pets, though this was an article in Sports Illustrated in 1965, but also what was happening at these places that were sources for research animals. So this is an article that was in Life magazine in 1966 called Concentration Camps for Dogs. And it did a really good job of exposing these poor living conditions of animals that were being bred for research by unregulated animal dealers, because there just weren't regulations governing their care, or either when we're talking about for the breeders or in later situations. So a law was drafted in response to public outcry of the treatment of these animals, from those pets being stolen, all of this. And it's just as a side note, it's important to note that the history of animal welfare regulation in the United States is relatively recent. I mean, I realize the 60s were like 80 years ago, but sometimes it is a shock to people to realize that we're talking about in the 60s, before there was actually federal legislation. The first U.S. law governing the welfare of animals in research was on a federal level, was the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act, which was passed in 1966. And now we call it the Animal Welfare Act because it has been expanded for the coverage of more animals. Now, the Animal Welfare Act is enforced by the USDA. They are the ones who actually perform that enforcement. They come and inspect institutions and other locations where animals that are covered are being used. They're the ones that issue fines in case of violations. The Animal Welfare Act requires that minimum standards of care and treatment be provided for certain animals, and that's whether they're being bred for commercial use, if they're being used in research, transported commercially, or exhibited to the public. So there are a lot of instances where we wouldn't necessarily immediately think of the Animal Welfare Act being a factor. So things like circuses, zoos, etc. But that's also newer improvements to the act. The original act predominantly covered dogs and cats and was limited in scope. I think no, it was just dogs and cats initially, but there have been a lot of amendments to the Animal Welfare Act over time to expand the species covered and the scope of what is being covered. Starting with in 1970, the list of covered animals was expanded. This is when they added exhibitors to the act. So that's circuses, zoos, petting zoos, that sort of thing. And they also provided definitions for what we actually consider a research facility. And the species that were then covered, they added rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs, non-human primates, and agricultural animals that are being used in biomedical research. So there's a lot of instances where animals, like say pigs, are used in biomedical research, and they became covered by the act. There are additional amendments that refine regulations for transport and commerce, ways that standards that have to be in place for animals that are being transported and sold. In 1985, there were additions and amendments to the act that included clarifications regarding what we mean by humane care that's being provided for these animals. So things like adding exercise requirements for dogs and cats, and primates, I think, also have exercise requirements. Further amendments in 1990, they established when it says established holding period for dogs and cats, they're talking about regulations for commerce. So if we're looking at breeders of dogs and cats, how old the animals can be before they're sold, how long they can be transported between temporary possessors, that sort of thing. In 2002, they changed the definition of animal in the act again, and by that we mean changing the species that are covered. In 2002, birds were excluded, but they changed it to say warm-blooded animals, but then excluded birds, rats of the genus Rattus, and mice of the genus Mus that have been bred for use in research. So those two lab rodent species and birds, but everything else, well, with exceptions that we'll talk about. Then animal fighting prohibition was added in 2007. It feels very recent to me. And then 2008, they increased fines for violations of the Animal Welfare Act. And then prohibited imports for resale of dogs under 6 months of age. So moving animals in and out of the country. Further amendments, so 2013, the modification of the definition of exhibitor. Mostly this is talking about like petting zoos. So a temporary petting zoo that is less than a substantial portion of income from a primary source would not be considered as an exhibitor. or you can go and exhibit your own animal for a limited amount of money, but that doesn't count. It's not covered under the act, basically, is what it's saying. And then 2020 updates to licensing requirements for breeders, updates to care standards for dogs. And then recently, they eliminated the requirement for research facility registration updates at 3-year intervals. Research facilities have to maintain a registration, but they made the intervals longer. They eliminated the requirement for a research facility to request being placed on inactive status. That's just has to do with how frequently they are being inspected, and then clarifies the duration of a registration, going along with that in terms of the registration update intervals. They removed that requirement for annual review of activities. So this is a thing later on when we talk about animal use protocols at research institutions. It used to be that there was a yearly report for any animal use protocol that was using the Animal Welfare Act regulated species. They had to submit a yearly report. They don't have to do that anymore. And then eliminated the requirement for the CEO and IO signatures on that annual report. So the facility still has to have an annual report. It's just not an annual report for each and every animal use protocol. And then recent big change is that they added birds to coverage for under the Animal Welfare Act. And that it does exclude birds that have been bred for use in research, which sort of makes for interesting interpretations of the law in terms of like if a researcher goes out and captures birds and brings them back to the lab, those birds are covered and under the oversight of the Animal Welfare Act. But then if those birds are bred, their offspring are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act because technically they've been bred for research. So this was put through in 2023. And so it took some time to get all of that in place for not just Texas A&M, but for most institutions. And so now, with that addition, the Animal Welfare Act covers all warm-blooded vertebrate animals except for farm animals that are used for agricultural research, which typically will say food or fiber research. And that means pigs, cattle, some uses of horses. Those are examples of if they're being used for agricultural research, they're not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. But there are other instances of agricultural research that we might not automatically think of. So things like ostriches and emus that are being used in agricultural research related to meat production, things like minks or chinchillas for fur, that sort of thing. And then birds that have been bred for use in research, and mice and rats that have from those genera, the mus and rattus, that were bred for use in research. And it's not on the slide here, but also wildlife studies where the animal is not significantly affected or altered. So there are lots of instances where there are wildlife studies where the animals have very little interference. If an animal has like a tracking collar or something like that, where the animal is being interfered with on a very limited basis, and those are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act as well. But there's the line for where that's covered is a little tenuous. Well, as I said, the USDA, they are the ones who regulate the Animal Welfare Act, and the Animal Welfare Act is interpreted through the Animal Welfare Act regulations. The regulations are the ones that actually provide that specific information. The dog must have X number of hours of exercise, that sort of thing. The USDA comes and performs inspections. They are at least annual and they are unannounced. So the VMO, that's the veterinary medical officer who is the inspector, they just show up and they can inspect housing areas, any research locations, records, any areas that are associated with covered species and covered research. Non-compliance with the Animal Welfare Act, it is published on the USDA webpage. So you and anyone else capable of looking up on the USDA webpage and looking at any institution that performs covered activities and seeing what their history of compliance are. And then there are fines levied for serious violations. For just a few of those requirements, the current requirements, so the research facilities have to be inspected every 6 months. And by that, we mean inspected by IACUC members, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the Animal Welfare Act does describe the requirements for an IACUC. That's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which is a group of researchers and other individuals who make decisions regarding the use of research animals at an institution. But we'll get more into that here in a little bit. But the important fact here is that they are required to be performing inspections as well every 6 months. And a housing location under the Animal Welfare Act, a housing location is considered anywhere that animals are held for more than 12 hours. This is important because for PHS policy, it's actually 24 hours. So it's different between the two. And the Animal Welfare Act still does require that any protocols, those animal use protocols, are reviewed and approved by the IACUC at intervals not exceeding 3 years. So that means that there is a 3-year approval time for any AUPs. They have to expire after 3 years. And I should point out that when we're talking about a protocol with USDA covered animals, if an AUP has mice and rabbits, it is still under the oversight of the USDA because of the rabbits, even though the mice from the genus Mus wouldn't normally be covered. The USDA requires an annual report to be produced by the facility that documents all of the animals that have been used, determined by their pain and distress categories for the previous year. Those reports are due December 1, and they cover that coverage year is actually beginning of October to end of September. So our coverage period just ended. That annual report is being prepared as of right now. And the USDA does require record maintenance for a minimum of 3 years for any of those animal use protocols. Now, moving on, we can talk about PHS policy. So the PHS policy is the result of that Health Research Extension Act of 1985. The act itself provides the legislative mandate for PHS policy. I keep saying that it's Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. That's the actual name. But the Health Research Extension Act directs the NIH to establish guidelines for the proper care and treatment of animals that are being used in research. All vertebrate animals that are used in PHS-funded research are covered by PHS policy. And this is actually, so this is how it is casually described. When we're talking about vertebrate animals that are used in PHS-funded research, the reality is that any vertebrate animals that are being used at a research institution that accepts PHS-funded research are covered by PHS policy. So, which is enforced by the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, or OLAW. So what that means is, for example, Texas A&M University that accepts PHS funding in a variety of ways, they accept that funding, and so therefore all the vertebrate animals at the institution are covered by PHS policy, whether or not that individual project is PHS funded or not. OLAW, so OLAW doesn't have scheduled inspectors like the Animal Welfare Act. They use a mechanism for self-policing and self-reporting, meaning that the institution or the IACUC, the Animal Welfare Office, they all work together to identify non-compliance, instances of non-compliance. When we're talking about non-compliance is a lack of compliance with those approved animal use protocols and from PHS policy. And the non-compliance has to be reported to OLAW along with corrective actions as suggestions as to what can be changed in order to improve it. Serious and uncorrected violations can result in the loss of PHS funding to individuals or the institution as a whole. So serious and uncorrected violations could end up causing an entire university to lose their PHS funding. And I mean, when we talk about PHS funding, we are talking about CDC funding, we're talking about NIH funding, just a lot of pretty crucial funding for research organizations. Institutions and entities that accept PHS funds must provide a written assurance to the NIH office. When we say an assurance, and it is renewed a maximum of every 5 years. The assurance has to describe the program for the care and use of animals. So all of the aspects of that animal use program. It has to list important members in the administration that looks at the animal program. The assurance provides the qualifications of the IACUC members and describes procedures that the IACUC will follow to fulfill the requirements of PHS policy. So just to talk, and we'll talk a little bit more about PHS policy. So they also require that inspection at least once every 6 months. So that inspection that's performed by the IACUC. When we say animal facilities, it's basically any, I can read through this list, but basically we're talking about anywhere the animals are used, housed, transported, anything like that. And housing, like I said, is defined as location where animals are held for more than 24 hours. PHS policy also requires that 3-year review. And then it requires a semi-annual program review to be conducted by the IACUC. And that program review involves a number of aspects of just examining the program to make sure that it is following all applicable regulatory guidelines. And then PHS also requires an annual report. That annual report goes to OLAW, the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, and covers the same time period. The PHS policy, as their main guidelines, they use this, which is the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. It's an actual book, lots and lots of details, lots and lots of information provided. It is the primary guidance document. The current edition is this 8th edition. They are actually working on a 9th edition. So it'll be a big upheaval at that point. But the guide provides standards for all different kinds of things. It outlines how an animal care and use program should be constructed. And it also requires an occupational health program for any personnel who work with or have contact with animals or animal tissues. This is an interesting point. Lots of people don't understand that the occupational health program that we have at Texas A&M University is a direct requirement from PHS policy, and that's because of what is included in the guide. The guide does provide standards for the safety of personnel as well as animals. And then we have, moving on, we can talk about the U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals that are used in testing, research, and training. Now, these were published in the Federal Register in 1985 by the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And these principles provide guidelines to follow in the implementation and development of animal policies for the United States. So they're not very specific necessarily, but they provide guidelines framework from which to work from. And you'll see what I mean when we go through them. So first, the transportation, care, and use of animals should be in accordance with the Animal Welfare Act and other applicable laws. Principle 2, procedures involving animals should be designed and performed with due consideration of their relevance to human or animal health. So, the advancement of knowledge or the good of society. So there must be a justified reason for the research. It does have to be, that justification does have to be provided. Principle 3 describes the concepts based on the idea of reduction. So we're going to be reiterating those 3 R's in different parts of the principles, but the animals selected for a procedure should be of an appropriate species and quality, and the minimum number required to obtain valid results. And then it also talks about replacement. So methods such as mathematical models, computer simulation, and in vitro biological systems should be considered. 4, the proper use of animals, including the avoidance or minimization of discomfort, distress, and pain when consistent with sound scientific practices is imperative. And this is a very important part. Unless the contrary is established, investigators should consider that procedures that cause pain or distress in human beings may cause pain or distress in other animals. So this is the basis for determination as to whether a procedure causes more than momentary pain and distress, because there are many instances where the data is just lacking, especially when we're talking about so-called cold-blooded vertebrates. If we're talking about neurological sensations and things like salamanders, fish, sharks, rays, that sort of thing. So a lot of the time, the scientific literature is lacking in terms of being able to provide a description of what we would reasonably assess as distress in those animals. And so if the research isn't there, we have to consider it on a basis of what would cause pain or distress in human beings. So this is an important thing to have, and something that as a member of the Animal Welfare Office, we do talk to people about this on a regular basis. Principle 5, procedures with animals that may cause more than momentary or slight pain or distress should be performed with appropriate sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia. Surgery or other painful procedures should not be performed on unanesthetized animals paralyzed by chemical agents. It means there needs to be appropriate pain control. There needs to be no paralytics being used on conscious animals. And this is basically anti-vivisection. So that was a practice prior to the initiation of animal welfare regulations. That's why it's specifically being called out here, because it was a practice. Principle 6, animals that would otherwise suffer severe chronic pain or distress that cannot be relieved should be painlessly killed at the end of the procedure, or if appropriate, during the procedure. So we'll mention this later, but this is basically, we're talking about humane endpoints. So animals that are undergoing research procedures, we should be making considerations as to when we can end their suffering in whatever way possible. And if their suffering can't be ended by a discontinuation of procedures, then they should be euthanized as appropriate. And principle 7, the living conditions of animals should be appropriate for their species and contribute to their health and comfort. And it mentions that this care needs should be directed by a veterinarian or other scientist that has that appropriate training, and that veterinary care shall be provided as indicated. So these animals, their care and comfort needs to be scientifically directed. Appropriate husbandry is required for research animals. Principle 8, basically appropriate training is essential. So personnel need to be appropriately qualified and experienced to conduct procedures, and the training needs to be documented and adequate. And then finally, where exceptions are required in relation to the provisions of these principles, the decision should not rest with the investigators directly, but should be made by an appropriate review group, such as the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So basically what it's saying is that there are exceptions to these principles that may occasionally be scientifically justified, but the evaluation of that scientific justification needs to be made by an appropriate review group. And they call out specifically the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And in most instances, that's what we would be talking about when we're talking about the review group. So I mentioned the Ag Guide, and it is just a companion document to the regular guide. It is not tied to federal regulation, but many institutions require its use and implementation, especially for institutions that perform a lot of agricultural research. So like Texas A&M, we are required to make considerations based on standards in the Ag Guide, because in part because our institution performs so much research that is based on industry standards, because they're trying to do research on like what would actually be applicable within the industry. And then finally, we have ALAC International. So ALAC used to stand for the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care. Now they have dropped that and they just call themselves ALAC, but this is an international organization. It is not administered by the federal government. So this is not federally regulated per se. It is a voluntary organization. Our membership is voluntary, and they make recommendations based on the results of site visits. The site visits occur every 3 years, I believe. ALAC accreditation is the gold standard for research organizations. So Texas A&M likes to maintain a high standard for themselves in most respects, and certainly in the respect of animal welfare. ALAC uses the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, just like PHS policy does, but they go beyond that. The guide is their basic, but then they go above and beyond that in order to establish the requirements for that accreditation that they issue to institutions. I can say that though this is not a requirement in terms of federal regulation, there are a number of funding organizations, the most notable, which is the Department of Defense, that does require ALAC accreditation of institutions in order to give them funding. So like if Texas A&M lost their ALAC accreditation, we would no longer be eligible for funding from the Department of Defense. Which I thought when I first started, I thought that was like a nice surprise, you know, that the Department of Defense cares that much. And then Texas A&M also has institutional rules and guidances, including guidance documents, which are documents that have been prepared and approved by our IACUC that look at specific procedures and standards for animal protocol usage. And now we'll talk just a bit about the IACUC-ism. I'm not talking slowly, but I'm moving slowly. Sorry. I'll be a little more brief from my slides. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. We went through those different regulations. So it's required by the Animal Welfare Act, required by PHS policy. The makeup of those IACUCs is a little different between these different legislation. So the Animal Welfare Act requires 3 members, a chair, a veterinarian, and a non-affiliated member. That's the minimum members that can be in the IACUC. And then PHS policy requires a minimum of 5 members, the chair, the veterinarian, an additional scientist, research scientist, a non-scientist, and a non-affiliated member. So when it's talking in here about a non-affiliated member, this is supposed to be somebody who has no ties to the institution whatsoever. The non-affiliated member is meant to specifically represent a member of the public, so they can provide their public input to protocols that they see, which is kind of neat. And then the non-scientist, so this can be a member of the institution, but they are not a research scientist. So our non-scientists at Texas A&M, they are from the law school or library sciences. So they're faculty from library science or law school. And the members of the IACUC are appointed by and report to the CEO of the institution. The IACUC is responsible for reviewing and approving those animal use protocols, like I was talking about. So they can also withhold approval of animal activities. They do have that power. The IACUC also reviews and approves or withholds approval for changes to that animal use protocol. We call that an amendment. So it's perfectly typical for a researcher to need to make changes to their animal use protocol during that 3-year approval period. That's an amendment, and the IACUC reviews that as well. The IACUC conducts those semi-annual inspections of animal areas, including animal housing. They investigate all animal welfare concerns that come in, and they conduct those semi-annual reviews of the animal care and use program. The IACUC can also suspend an activity that involves animals if the activity is not being conducted according to what they've approved or according to any federal regulatory policy or the institution's assurance. It does point out that suspensions may only occur at a convened IACUC meeting with a quorum present, so more than 50%. It's just because, two IACUC members out of a IACUC of 30 can't decide to suspend a protocol. It has to be a majority of the members at the meeting. But protocols do get suspended when there is established evidence of non-compliance or other animal welfare concerns. So that does happen. It's happened several times during my tenure in the office here at Texas A&M. And they also make recommendations to the IO to help out with more things. So when a protocol is submitted to the IACUC, our IACUC has two review options. I think for most IACUCs would use both. So there's a designated member review, which is basically where the IACUC chair appoints an individual to perform a review of the protocol on behalf of the IACUC. And then sometimes there might be two DMRs assigned. That's the designated member reviewer. There might be two or more assigned based on the contents of the AUP. So like there are certain conditions which require more than one DMR to have a look at, or just our IACUC has decided that that's what the appropriate amount of people for review would be. And then there's also full committee review. So a protocol can be sent to be reviewed by the entire IACUC, and that does occur too. It just depends on whether an IACUC member calls it for full committee review, typically warranted by the use of USDA covered species or novel approaches or approaches with other concerns, right? So during full committee review, they can approve an AUP, they can request modifications to gain approval. It's very rare for any protocol to come through without needing at least a few modifications. And then the committee can also choose to withhold approval. During the protocol review, there's going to be a lot of considerations. They're going to consider health and welfare. They're going to consider that scientific justification for the use of the animals. They're going to consider if there's appropriate implementation of the 3 R's, like we talked about. If the pain and distress level is appropriate, if it's the lowest level possible for the research that needs to be performed, justification for the number of animals, and an assurance that the research is not duplicative. It's not being done when there are 10 studies who've already established the same thing. In general, the ethical considerations of the IACUC have to do with ethical balance. There should be an acceptable ethical cost-benefit relationship to assure that the research is ethical, that balance of the harm versus the benefit. And furthermore, we do have the opportunity to change this balance or to tip the scales for the scientific value to outweigh the ethical cost. And we would do that by decreasing the ethical cost. But we could increase the scientific value. How could we do that? We could start with careful experimental design to ensure that there's scientific rigor being met. We can use power analyses, make sure that there's no unnecessary duplication happening. That's a way to increase the value of the scientific research. We can decrease the ethical cost by implementing the 3 R's. So that reduction, replacement, and refinement, those are all ways to decrease the ethical cost and improve the animal welfare for a given study. And then additional considerations for protocol. So that experimental versus humane endpoints. I mentioned humane endpoints before. It's just a feature of making sure that to whatever extent possible, those humane endpoints are chosen as early as possible in the study. So once the experimental endpoints have been reached, the humane endpoints should be as soon as possible after that. Or alternately, there are humane endpoints that need to be implemented prior to the experimental endpoints being reached. And that would be if the study doesn't require conditions to have reached that and humane endpoint. Put this. So like if something, sometimes your animals just get infections or something like that. If an animal is showing significant negative physical effects, then a humane endpoint would say, oh, okay, this animal has lost this amount of weight. That is our humane endpoint. It doesn't matter whether the experimental endpoint has been reached or not. We need to euthanize this animal because they are suffering. So a humane endpoint is another way that we reduce animal pain and suffering. And then just another consideration, make sure that appropriate euthanasia methods are being used, which euthanasia methods, unless strongly scientifically justified otherwise, they have to match those methods that are listed in the AVMA guidelines for euthanasia. That's the American Veterinary Medical Association's published guidelines for euthanasia. And we need to make sure that that the personnel are appropriately trained. During protocol review by the full committee, all members have equal weight, views have to be heard and respected, and decisions are made by the majority rule. When we're talking about changes to a protocol, the IACUC can choose whether something is a significant or minor change. These are some examples of significant changes. So things like changes in surgeries, the PI, etc., changes in euthanasia method, duration, frequency, type, or number of procedures performed on an animal. Yeah, so significant changes have to be reviewed by the IACUC. There can be a VVC, which is considered, that's really not a significant change. It would just be like a minor change that is approved by the veterinarian without it having to go through the IACUC, but it is a minor change. So an example of something like that could be approved by the veterinarian would be an increase in previously approved animal numbers by a specific margin. And then our office can do things like correcting grammar, typographical errors, changes in personnel other than the PI with review of training. Non-compliance is the conduct of animal-related activities without appropriate IACUC review and approval. As it says, they must be reported to regulatory agencies like OLAW uses that self-reporting, and non-compliance can result in fines and all of that other bad stuff when we talking about when we lose public trust. So loss of institutions' reputation, scrutiny, and attention from animal rights groups. These are all possibilities that result from non-compliance. And we're going to end by giving just a few examples of non-compliance, just so you know what I'm talking about. First example, a longtime AUP participant trains new personnel on a blood sampling technique. Later, the new participant reads the AUP and discovers that this technique requires anesthesia, but this is not how they were trained. So this is an example of non-compliance. It does occur, and that's because participants are not reading the AUP when they are first added to it, which they are supposed to be doing, but this does happen. It's almost sort of like a game of telephone. You know, one person trains another person who trains another person who trains another person, and the actual approved technique gets lost. Second example, study participant for AUP1 enters the vivarium. A request has been submitted to add them to the personnel list for AUP2, but has not been approved. The unapproved participant is asked to begin weighing animals listed on AUP2 without supervision. This is technically non-compliance. If they are not approved on that particular AUP, doesn't matter if they're approved on any other AUP. If they are not approved on that particular AUP that has those animals that they are performing procedures on, then it's non-compliance. And then another example, a wildlife researcher has two AUPs, one which authorizes blood samples to be taken and one that only describes trapping and euthanasia. The blood sample containing AUP expires, but a desired species is trapped, and so a blood sample is taken anyway. So this is just like with the personnel, same concept. If specific procedures are listed on one AUP and not the other, you can't switch. You can't go back and forth. It has to be only that AUP. And if it's expired, then you don't get to perform those procedures anymore. It doesn't matter how many other approved AUPs you have. Thank you.